We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Introduction. It is pointless to see the tragedy of Soviet Russian literature, as some do, in the mere existence of great numbers of literary hacks, since even democratic societies are heavily burdened by inferior writers. The real tragedy of post-revolutionary Russian literature lies in what has happened to a small number of exceptional authors who, under normal circumstances, would have made us forget the mediocre crowd. Through unofficial and official pressures, these few talented men were forced into silence, into varying degrees of conformity, or into exile. The names of them are hardly known to their countrymen or to the world. One of these unusual men was Yevgeny Ivanovich Zamyatin, who died in France as a voluntary exile in 1937. Zamyatin was born in 1884 in the central Russian town of Lebedian. While studying at the St. Petersburg Polytechnical Institute, he developed an interest in social and political problems, an interest that was to be strongly reflected in his literary work. He became actively involved in the revolutionary movement and suffered both imprisonment and banishment. A tale called Provincial Life, which came out in 1911, was Zamyatin's first ambitious attempt at writing, and it showed him to be a meticulous craftsman with exceptionally acute analytical powers. 3 years later, these talents were again demonstrated in At the End of the World, a story for which the government tried unsuccessfully to prosecute him on the grounds of anti-militarism. In 1917, Zamyatin published The Islanders and The Fisher of Men, tales in which his satirical abilities were first given full play, with the English, among whom he had lived briefly during the war, serving as the victims. Zamyatin had worked and suffered so that the revolution might take place. While it finally became a reality, he greeted it with enthusiasm and spent endless hours in lecture halls and conference rooms on its behalf. But he was quick to notice the alarming tendencies that were developing in the new society, and in his writing he boldly pointed out the impending dangers. I Fear, an essay which appeared in 1920, warned against the insidious pressures for conformity. The new Russia would have no real literature until it cured itself of this illness, and if the illness proved incurable, then there would be only one illness, then there would be only one future for Russian literature, its past. The novel We, written in the same year, treated the problem of conformity on a much broader scale. Although the book could not be published in the Soviet Union, it was not unknown to the critics there, since it was read in manuscript form and, during the 20s, appeared abroad in English, French, and Czech translations. In such short stories as Draco, The Cave, Mamai, and A Story About the Most Important Matter, Zamyatin stressed with satirical force the cruelty, the pettiness, the futility characterizing Russia under the new order. His play, The Fires of Saint Dominic, while ostensibly dealing with the Spanish Inquisition, was actually aimed at the activities of the Soviet security police. In criticism, fiction, and drama that showed his constantly maturing satirical and analytical abilities, Zamyatin fought to preserve his vision of the revolution. Antagonized by Zamyatin's insistence on telling the truth as he saw it, by his open disdain for anything that smacked of literary servility, communist critics opened an offensive against him which reached an incredibly vituperative intensity after 1929, when a Russian version of "We", allegedly retranslated from the Czech, was published abroad. Zamyatin, the self-styled "devil" of Soviet literature, was thoroughly exercised, and every effort was made to prevent any further contact between him and the public. Publishers and theaters were intimidated into ignoring him. Libraries were forbidden to circulate his work. In June 1931, Zamyatin wrote a letter to Joseph Stalin. This letter was not the sort that dictators are accustomed to receive. Far from being an abject plea, it displayed an unruffled dignity underscored by an ironical tone. The author stated that he was no longer free to continue with his writing, that such a situation was for him tantamount to a death sentence, and that he was requesting permission to leave the Soviet Union. Permission was granted, and, for all practical purposes, Zamyatin's career came to an end. Cut off from the immediate reality of Russia, he never again produced anything that equaled his earlier work. Initially because of the time-consuming service in the revolutionary cause, and later because of the frustrating pressures that gradually deprived him of access to editorial and theater offices, Zamyatin's quantitative contribution to the Soviet Russian criticism, fiction, and drama was very slim. But if the Zamyatin chapter of Soviet Russian literature is necessarily brief, it is nevertheless brilliant, for here was a man who possessed the social and psychological perceptiveness, the courage, and the technical skill which identify the real creative artist. Such a man can produce work that is vitally significant in his own era, and that retains the significance with the passage of time. This is true of Zamyatin's short stories, plays, and criticism. They were important for his day and have kept their freshness with the passage of time. But the writing of such a man can, in its basic conception, leap beyond immediacy. It may have a certain topical relevancy in his time, but its main impact will be saved for the future. The novel "We" belongs in this category. Today, in the problems it poses, it is even more important than it was 39 years ago. It is an example of how man's imagination can intuitively grasp the essence of his own future problems. In the first years of the 20s, "We" was simply another variation on the utopian theme, a clever, stimulating, satirical fantasy that inspired speculation and debate. The ruling principle of the rigidly controlled society in "We" is that freedom and happiness are incompatible. Men are congenitally incapable of using their freedom for constructive ends, and merely make themselves miserable by their abuse of it. Most of them yearn for a materialistic happiness and are eager to surrender their troublesome freedom and to be reduced to the status of lotus eaters. This was hardly a new theory, except in its application. Zamyatin had obviously become intrigued by the guiding philosophy of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and had skillfully adapted it to the needs of a modern technological state. But provocative as this restatement was, a stable society based on it was hardly credible within the context of those years. Although strange and ugly social and political theories were circulating, and even put into limited practice, it was still generally believed that man was not desperately committed to a goal of material happiness, and that he was a born rebel who, except during such emergencies as wartime, could not be forced to tolerate more than a minimal amount of regimentation for a very long. What made we even less credible were the scientific advances which it predicted. At the time, there was also an unintentionally comic note for most readers. Zamyatin was obviously thinking about future developments in the Soviet Union when he wrote "we", and to any sensible person, the implication that that backward country could ever build a successful interplanetary rocket was ludicrous. When the modern totalitarian states proved how meticulous they could refine and organize the apparatus of control, the history finally began to catch up with we. The mathematical precision of life in Zamyatin's glass paradise was no longer an improbable nightmare. We seemed like an early blueprint for what was now happening in the world, an advanced textbook for the regimentation of mankind. In the novel there were unanimous elections which were unabashedly ritualistic in nature, prophylactic surveillance of private lives as well as torture were justified by reasoning that was as specious as it was pious. Denunciations, even of the closest to one, were encouraged. Children were considered the property of the state, and art was completely subservient to the aims of society. These and other characteristics of the state that Zamyatin had envisioned were now integral parts of a way of life in totalitarian countries. With respect to the most extreme practices outlined in "we", the question was not whether, but when they would be realized. It became plain that even if man is born a rebel at heart, his psychological makeup is so plastic he can usually be effectively intimidated to the point where he will accept a rigidly controlled pattern of life for a long period of time. Since history proved Zamyatin right in this respect, the problems of the people in "we" who dare to think have lost their haze of unreality. In the light of what has been and is still occurring in totalitarian states, such problems have become fresh and compelling. But the prophetic scope of "we" has not been fully exhausted. Totalitarianism has shown that Zamyatin's state was right about the practicability of intensive regimentation over long periods of time. However, there has been no broad proving ground for the theory on which Zamyatin's state is built. The theory that most men believe their freedom to be more than a fair exchange for a high level of materialistic happiness. It appears, though, that this theory will be put to a final test in the future. If the present rapid rate of technological development continues, both totalitarian and democratic societies will be involved in this test. When the material wants of the Soviet people are satisfied, will many of them continue to resent regimentation? As we ourselves pursue even higher goals of materialistic happiness, the complexity of our technological society will increase and exert even more intense pressures for efficiency through the regulation of our lives. What decision will we make under those circumstances? Mankind is rushing towards a final proof or refutation of Zamyatin's prophecy. In this novel, Zamyatin tried to put into practice his belief that, in its content, a literary work should be heretical, refusing to accept reality at its face value and always possessing those two final, most terrifying, most fearless questions. Why? And what lies ahead? He also attempted to carry out his conviction that form should keep up with ideas, that only a heretical form could adequately dramatize heretical ideas. Drawing on the techniques of Gogol, Dostoevsky, Andreev, and Bloch, Zamyatin had created his own synthesis, and this was now adapted to the special needs of we. The novel uses the notebook format, which is a particularly flexible medium for reflecting the various moods of the narrator. A dynamic pace as well as a multidimensional characterization is obtained by techniques that are grounded in the principles of human psychology. As the narrator's emotional state changes, his perception moves between the extreme limits of objectivity and subjectivity. There is a dramatic running duel between the rational and the irrational forces within him, a shifting between his conscious and unconscious powers of perception, and a constant association of ideas that forms elaborate networks. Accompanying this psychological method is a laconic language that frequently lapses into the provocatively elliptical and imparts a sensation of breathlessness. Compressed and startlingly strange similes and metaphors are used in a variety of sophisticated roles. They not only serve the conventional purpose of intensifying the description of a person or object, but they also sharply characterize the narrator and his environment. They are frequently linked to an individual through so much repetition that they attain an impressionistic force, and sometimes they are employed as a triggering mechanism to flood the reader's mind with impressions that were associated with these figures earlier in the narrative. The total effect of this imagery is to provide the novel with a strong inner unity. Zamyatin once gave an apt metaphorical definition of good books, and this definition could well apply to we. There are books of the same chemical composition as dynamite. The difference lies only in the fact that one stick of dynamite explodes once, but one book explodes thousands of times. It is very unfortunate that circumstances prevented Zamyatin from writing other books with such an explosive potential. The ability was there, but the opportunity was not. Peter Rudy, Northwestern University, 1959.